Welcome to the Audit and Transparency Committee meeting, 28th of September. First of all, we're going to start with apologies for absence. I think we have one apology from Councillor Dent-Code. Everyone else is present. Declarations of interest. If I could lead off, because obviously I'm the Vice Chair of the Investment Committee, and the pension accounts are looked at in here. Councillor Williams.
I'm Chairman of the Pension Board.
Any other declarations?
My standing declaration that I'm an employee of.
Thank you. Now we turn to the external audit report. Phil, do you want to lead us off? Thank you.
So the report which is in front of you is the totality of the work we've done on the Council's financial statements for the 2021 audit year, and shares with you all the information we believe is relevant to your responsibilities as members in determining whether or not to approve the financial statements for the 2021 financial year. Overall, the accounts were of a good quality. They were materially accurate when they were presented to us in draft form, and following the audit they remain materially accurate. Two adjustments which were made in the accounts which have been processed in terms of the actual financial statements themselves, which are detailed in the report, neither of which caused me any great cause for concern in terms of the reason that they were needed. And in fact, as a set of accounts, as sets of accounts go for large, medium to large-sized London boroughs of this complexity, that's a pretty good outcome in terms of those are the only adjustments on the main primary statements within the financial statements that are there. There are some further disclosure adjustments and presentation adjustments that we've also detailed in the report. Nothing of any great significance other than the bits I'll pull out of the report as we go through. But from a material perspective, nothing that causes me any concern that the accounts are anything other than free from material misstatement or error that are in front of you. You're in a rare position because most councils in the country will not be signing by or certainly won't have, the audit is not finished by the statutory deadline. Our audit is by and large done. The final I's and T's are being dotted and crossed. That is in large part to the strong working relationship on the ground we have with the finance team and the quality of the information provided and the speed with which it is provided in response to audit queries. Audits are now, these days, extremely rigorous and difficult processes for any audited body to have to facilitate. But the information we've been given and the response that we've had has been very helpful to getting us to this position today, whereby at the end of September the audit is by and large finished. The audit code of practice, and we're in year one of that, has changed the scope of the value for money work, and in this year it's decoupled it, largely due to COVID, but I think my personal view is that that's a good thing in any event. So the value for money work will come later to a later committee in a separate report in terms of the wider scope of the arrangements in place corporately across the council. This report focuses solely on the financial statements and any messages for members in respect to those statements before approving the accounts. So I'll draw out the key parts of this report. It is a big beast, so I will draw out the key parts, and I'm happy to go back to any particular parts that members would like to focus on. On page 6 of the report, we set out our materiality levels. We reported earlier in the year in terms of our audit plan, our planning materialities for the pension fund and for the main audit were both at 11 million. On receipt of the financial statements, we always reassess materiality to see whether or not it's still an appropriate numerical figure for the financial statements as they are given to us in draft form. For the main audit statements, the final materiality was unchanged on the basis that the accounts were not too dissimilar from the values that we expected at the planning stage. For the pension fund, we were able to increase materiality to 14.5 million. This is largely because the value of the pension fund assets had increased, or the net assets had increased. We were happy they hadn't increased for anything unexceptional. It was largely the movements of the market, which is a normal reason, and on that basis we amended our materiality accordingly. As you may well be aware from previous years, so that doesn't mean that anything below those figures we ignore. We report to you all salient matters. What it does mean that that's the threshold below which a reader of the accounts spending as much money as Kensington spends wouldn't be misled by an error that's lower than that materiality threshold, or wouldn't form a different view of the council and its financial position if the value of the error individually or cumulatively is below that threshold. And as you'll see in the appendices, the various bits we've identified are well below that threshold in terms of the accounts as a whole. Earlier in the year, we reported again in our audit plan, the significant risk areas of the financial statements. These are the areas where we believe are most likely to lead to material error in the accounts, largely not because of any particular risk within the council, but because they are areas in and of themselves which are inherently risky. They're informed by estimates and expert judgments, often outside of the council. It's things like the valuation of your assets, the valuation of your pension liabilities, and there's also some inherent risks we're required to assume are significant in every audited body in the country, which is the risk of manipulation of your revenue income and the management override of controls in terms of the journals. For the revenue, we were able to rebut that risk largely because the revenue which the council generates, the vast majority of it is year-specific, it's grant-based, it's taxation-based, and the incentive isn't there to manipulate the revenue. The management override of controls, we set out on page 8, the work that we've done in response to that risk, and we're satisfied that no material error has arisen in the financial statements, and that risk hasn't materialised in the year of audit. A couple of control points in terms of journals that we've raised, neither of which are huge, and both of which were the same as the previous year. Management is comfortable that there are mitigating controls over those controls. We're satisfied that none of the work we've done has identified that those controls are defective. The 2 points being, one is that there is senior access to the journal system, and the second is that there's no secondary authorization control. They are good practice points to have in a system, and we report it because we're obligated to do so. We're also comfortable with the council's response in terms of the overarching control environment in place, and by virtue of the fact that our audit work did not identify that those risks leading to it being actualised in terms of any error. The other financial statement risks that significant risks that we mentioned, and I won't go through them one by one, but in all cases we are satisfied that those risks were mitigated. There was also a significant risk that we raised that was related to the transfer in terms of the pension system. We were able to de-risk that because the figures were based on the old system, so pre-transfer, and so the risk of error arising because of the transfer process has gone away until next year's audit, where we'll look at that again in terms of any post-transfer. The other risk area that we raised was in terms of the fire tragedy and how potential liabilities from that are accounted for. Management's judgment was that it is too soon in the process to be able to quantify any potential liability that may arise from the fire tragedy. And because it is too soon to quantify, management instead disclosed a contingent liability within the financial statements, which is in note 32, which essentially says there is potentially a large liability that may arise. It is dependent on the outcome of various investigations and inquiries, which include an apportionment of liability across various parties, and therefore, as at the date of the balance sheet, management is not in a position to accurately quantify what that liability may be, or even indeed the extent to which it may exist. We've considered that judgment in significant detail, and we're comfortable with that judgment, both in terms of its factual accuracy and the facts on which it is based, and also in terms of the judgments applied to those facts in determining what the accounting position should be. We asked management to articulate the fact that that judgment had been made in the critical judgment section of the accounts as well, but otherwise the disclosure which was in note 32 we are largely happy with in terms of its narrative. In our audit opinion, what we're also proposing to do is to draw readers' attention to that disclosure, because we consider it to be material qualitatively to a reader of the accounts, knowing the background of in Kensington and indeed with the fire. And so our opinion will make reference and emphasise the disclosure that management have made in the accounts, but that is not a qualification of our opinion. That is simply our opinion is unqualified, and also specifically pointing to this element of the financial statements. The audit report then goes on in some detail to set out the work that we've done across management's judgments across the estimates. In the audit plan, we set out that there was a new standard, ISO 540, which increases the work that both management and we as auditors need to do over the estimates and judgments in the accounts, and so we've reported the work against those. The biggest figures are, as I've said, your fixed assets, your pension liabilities, and then other related elements that are above our materiality threshold, and we've set out the work, management's judgment, the work we've done, and whether we're happy or not with that judgment. And in all cases, for those judgments, we are comfortable with them. There's one judgment where we've raised some commentary, which is not a material judgment, and it's to do with the minimum revenue provision. This is essentially an accounting technique within local government accounts that enables that councils are required to set aside a sum of money each year to pay for the long-term financing of investment borrowing and related. The council's policy is not to make a provision on the dwellings which are sitting in the general fund, which were largely purchased in response to Grenfell. If these assets were within the general fund, then it's appropriate not to make a provision for those assets. Our view is, as they are held outside of, if those assets were in the HRA, it's appropriate not to make a provision for those assets. Management has continued not to make that provision, even though these assets are outside the HRA. Our view is that we think that provision should be made. The difference in terms of the annual spend for the council of making it or not making it is very small. Cumulatively, over a large number of years, it could add up to quite a lot. We mention it not because it affects the materiality of the financial statements, but just because that's the one area where we've got a slight disagreement in terms of what the actual policy should be. But management's judgment is not going to prevent us from signing a clean opinion in the financial statements in that respect. The report then goes on further to some of the other judgments and specific things. There's the going concern is another standard that has changed slightly this year. The government has recognised, or rather the regulators have recognised that public bodies, the going concern of a public body is different from the going concern of a commercial entity. And whereas previously we were required to assess going concern in the same way we would any other commercial entity, both management and we are now able to place more emphasis on the fact that a public body, the continuation of services is the essential prerequisite for going concern, with the financial resilience of the body a secondary concern. On that basis, we're comfortable that, as is management, that both the pension fund and the council are going concerns, because the services would continue to be provided. Even if the council ran into financial difficulties, they would be taken over and provided elsewhere. And so on that basis, we're comfortable it's appropriate to produce the accounts on a going concern basis, and same for the pension fund. In the report, we look at the annual governance statements and look at the narrative reports. We issue what's called, I suppose, a negative opinion, in that we just assess, is it consistent with the work that we've done in terms of the financial statements itself, and in both cases, we're comfortable that those documents are consistent with our wider knowledge of the council and the specific audit work that we've done. The whole of government's accounts work, which is where everything is consolidated into UK PLC, we can't start that work until the NEO has issued its guidance to auditors for the group accounts. That guidance is unlikely to come before December, is what we're hearing. So that's work that will have to be done at a later date once the NEO has issued its instructions for this year's work. The appendices then go on in more detail in terms of some of the findings, recommendations and audit adjustments. Appendix A sets out some of the recommendations. That's the minimum revenue provision recommendation that I touched on earlier, the journal recommendation touched on earlier. Related parties is, so all members and senior officers are required to declare whether they have any conflicts of interest or other conflicts which could result in a related party. That would be, for example, if somebody in a controlling position of the council was also in a controlling position of a charity, and the council also happened to be giving that charity substantial sums of money, that would be an example of a related party. The arrangements in place are good. There were 4 members that hadn't returned their disclosures for the year. we'll make a recommendation to strengthen that process. If they're not returned, there's more work for management to sort of investigate to make sure the reason for the non-return is not because of anything's been hidden, and also more work for us because we need to then validate the work that's done. Ideally, what you would have is every member returning their disclosure each year, and that's our recommendation is to that effect. Over the page, we then talk points that we've raised in terms of exit packages. We struggled this year to get hold of the information needed to validate some of the work we do on the exit packages. And in particular, there's one instance where we weren't able to get hold of any legal advice supporting a compromise agreement and payment that was made in that respect. So we've made recommendations again to strengthen the arrangements there and the process followed in terms of the process has gone through in arriving at that position, and also having available the information and evidence to support any scrutiny of those figures when people like us come and ask to see it. There are also, what this did unearth is some issues which management shared with us that they have with the outsourced provider, whereby they struggle to obtain the information to support their own figures and the payments that have been made by the council but processed by this third-party provider. And I think the management's looking into strengthening that so that they're not in a position where they can't actually respond to requests to support their own expenditure because it's sitting with a third party that's not providing it.
May I please ask, do you want questions held to the end, or will we take them as we go?
If you note your questions, and then we'll come back to points. Once Paul's finished.
Thank you. The next few pages then set out the recommendations we raised in the prior year and whether or not they've been actioned. I'm very pleased to say all of the recommendations on the main audit financial statements have been actioned, and we're comfortable and happy that both that they've been addressed and also the underlying issues didn't reoccur this year. Similarly, for the pension fund, with the exception of the data quality issue in terms of some of the pension data, which management's looking to change with increased automation, which should help as well. But otherwise, I think it's a good news story in that sense. There are many places that I audit where there's a series of X's down prior recommendations, and that isn't the case here. And I think it's because the approach to the audit is to be responsive to recommendations made and to action them, which we're very pleased to see. Appendix C then is what we call the non-trivial adjusted misstatements, disclosure amendments, presentation amendments. It is in a set of accounts that's over 100 pages long and as complex as IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standard accounts are. I would be amazed that not to have a few pages of these disclosure amendments. But there is nothing in here again in terms of disclosures that causes me any concern in terms of the fact that they're there. Often they are technical in nature. There's a code of accounting which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. It's very easy to miss bits. So these just sets out what's changed between the draft and the final version in terms of presentation, but they don't affect the bottom line in that sense in terms of what was being reported. And then finally we have and same on a pension fund. Fewer issues because they're a simpler set of accounts, but again nothing that causes me any particular concern. Ultimately, on both the pension fund and the financial statements, we're proposing to issue an unqualified opinion. The opinion isn't in the pack as we were finalising the wording for, it was not in the report. We issued the report whilst finalising the wording for the opinion, so it isn't in the report. It's been shared with management and hopefully will be available to you, but otherwise, those are the key points I wanted to draw out of the report. Happy to take any questions that members may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to your team, obviously particularly Ellen, and everyone who's done such a wonderful job there, and doing it on time. And also thank you for your praise for the financial management team. I'm sure Taryn will take that back. And obviously very pleasing to see that all the prior recommendations have been done. Nice to know you're being listened to. Just to clarify quickly, so in terms of the audit opinion, we are awaiting the audit opinion letter with extra wording in it, are we? Okay. And that will be forthcoming?
Yes.
Thank you. Questions? Cosette?
Thank you, Chair. My question is with regard to Appendix A, page 35, and in particular, the passage where it says the council had paid an employee an ex gratia payment on the basis of legal advice outside of the established redundancy policy, and then goes on to say that this advice had not been documented. So my questions would be twofold. The first is, if it was outside the established redundancy policy, then which policy applied? And secondly, what steps have been taken to prevent this from ever happening again? It's highly unusual for any legal advice not to be put in writing.
Management may wish to comment. I'm not sure which policy it would have followed. It was outside the redundancy policy because it was part of a wider compromise agreement that involved the termination of employment, but was not wholly related to that. But it was wrapped up, I guess, in terms of the final solution to everything related to the individual. In terms of what should be in place, I think as a minimum, any council looking to make an ex gratia payment, you'd need the legal advice, you'd need in writing, you'd need an assessment of is this the best course of action to take in terms of is this payment the most cost-effective payment for the council? What are the other options? Why would they cost more? And what I see elsewhere is often legal advice would have also provided that to say, well, actually, you could take this option, it would likely cost you this much. You can take this option, it would cost you this much. So it's having that documented in writing, really, that to explain why the payment was made, and also to demonstrate that the decision made was the best decision of the various options available to the council.
Can I just follow on from that? Has internal audit had a look at that in particular?
That's not something we've looked at recently, Chair, but something we can add to the plan to look at going forward.
I think we should definitely add that to the plan, please. Yeah, as an action. Yes, Mr. Cassius.
So I think the point that's being made is correct, is that there isn't, that the legal advice isn't written down, not that the payments are unlawful. We have shown why the payments were made, and they are in accordance with legal advice, but as it says, that legal advice wasn't written down, it was given orally, it was agreed by the Director of HR and the Executive Director for the department. So in future, I think we do have to make sure that all that legal advice is in writing. I think that's the solution. But it is all identified in the compromise agreement with the employee concerned, and that has been shown to the auditors.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously our concern is that there's some large amounts.
Yeah, and they are identified in the agreement, and we've identified what those are. So the question is, and they're all, I think the auditors agree, are all lawful payments. They're all, the question is just that what Paul said about the consideration of other options and showing that happened. I mean, it did happen, but it didn't. It wasn't documented. So it's a lack of documentation issue.
May I ask?
Yes.
Was there a request to put it in writing and a refusal to do so?
No, because it's obviously it happened at the time, and it was put in writing in the COT3 agreement with the employee. It just isn't in writing. It's the legal advice that shows that was the best option that isn't in writing.
And subsequently, has any request been made to obtain that legal advice in writing after the fact, so that there's a complete record of the decision-making process?
We haven't, no. It hasn't been put in writing subsequent to the fact, no.
Okay, thank you.
David, yeah, I think if we can have put this on our action tracker for internal audit. I mean, I don't want to jump ahead, but this is going to come up in the accounts on page 58.
Yes.
You can't put a number that large in the accounts without an explanation. But we'll cover that when we get to the accounts, I think. Any other questions for Paul or Ellen? Liz?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chairman. I just noted on the minimum revenue provision, you said that the accounts were contravening statutory guidance, and whilst it wasn't material this year, it could be material in future years. Are we therefore just, by not following statutory guidance this year, just storing up a problem for the future?
Thank you, Robert.
I think it would take quite a while to become into a cumulatively material position. Essentially, the reason for the minimum revenue provision it's to store up the reserves, essentially, to cover the cost of the financing. So arguably, yes, but there's many factors that come into part of the strategic financial planning, which would be able to also, on a year-by-year basis, mitigate that if it were arising. Our point for raising it is to say it's potentially slightly undercooked, and you may want to look at how should you include it. But it is a longer-term consideration rather than anything of any immediate concern.
So are they addressing that going forward?
So what we need to do is to move this into the housing revenue account, which will address it, and we're just looking at how we can do that. It's a unique situation because there won't be any other authority that has housing in its, has such a large amount, certainly, of housing, if any, in its general fund accounts. If it's in the housing revenue account, we don't have to make that provision. But we have it in the general fund because we had the dispensation after Grenfell to hold the housing under general fund powers. So it will be addressed. It's just a matter of getting it, of moving it between the accounts. But it has to be affordable within the housing revenue account to do that.
Liz?
Yeah, and I just wondered, I was also, the auditor was actually suggesting in relation to journal entries that it should be a two-stage process, and you're not seeking to sort of follow that, and the auditor has said that, there is a risk of fraud and error. I think that's on page 34. I just had a concern about that.
If I can butt in now, Mike, one of the residents who was here at the last meeting was very sensitive to this particular matter of what was in the general fund and what was in the HRA fund. So it is particularly important that we assuage any concerns.
Sorry, Liz, my apologies. I missed. Did you get an answer to your last question?
We were looking at the, it was your response to the journal entries where the auditor is proposing that there should be a two-stage check, and that doesn't seem to be being taken forward.
So thank you for the question. So the ability for the journals is a feature of the system. So the nature of our financial system is based on self-serve. So there is that ability for senior managers too. But actually, some of the steps that we've put in place is some of those checks are kind of offline that we're able to do. So we're not able to necessarily build a two-stage process into the system, but we do build that into the kind of the offline check. So the financial accounts team will do kind of regular compliance monitoring and regular sample checking, and just run quarterly reports in terms of usage of different parts of the system. So that will start to identify if we've got any concerns. But it is a feature of the finance system, the ability that they can, which is why we do the off-system checks with that.
Any further questions? Great. Again, my thanks to Grant Thornton and the team. Next, we're going to, just a quick question. Is there any reason why we didn't do the minutes first? It's not on the agenda. I see. Good plan. Good plan. Right, then can we do the, so our guests are going to stay for the final statement of accounts, and then they can leave. would you like to stay for this next bit, and then you can... After. That'd be great. Thank you. Right, sorry. A4 then, final statement of accounts. Michael Charon, who's going to lead us off on this?
Thank you, Chair, and just like to put on record also our greatest thanks to Paul, Ellen and the team for obviously another kind of really productive and efficient audit process, so really grateful. I know you and the team worked really closely over the kind of couple of months that you're in, so really, really grateful. And just really my thanks to my team as well, and all the colleagues involved across the council. So we saw at the committee in June, we saw the draft accounts before the audit, as we just heard from Paul and colleagues. So we've gone through that audit process, and what you're seeing now is that final set of accounts for approval. We've talked about some of the adjustments that Paul's highlighted, so I won't touch on those specifically. I'm sure you've got a couple of questions. I think there is one outstanding query, and I think we've kind of touched on that there's a few last dotting of T's or dotting of I's and crossing of T's to be made. And then the next steps will be obviously to get those published on the website. Fingers crossed in line with the 30th of September, but obviously we've just got those last couple of queries to resolve. So I wasn't going to say anything else at this stage, Chair, really just open up for questions, because I think Paul has covered obviously the main findings of the audit.
Great. You know, I know we have the 30th of September deadline, but we would be in a very, very small minority of councillors who have managed to achieve that. And I think one thing we're all clear on is we want these to be right, and us to have all the information to hand before we approve them. And I think we might have a bit further to go, just if I may point out. Obviously, we've got quite a few blank pages in here for the independent auditors to report to go in. I know that there are later editions of the auditor's report that we haven't got in this pack due to a timing issue. So we want to see the pack fully completed before we agree to it. One other point, very minor, if this is ready to go for printing, page 94, there we're missing some brackets. Halfway down, debtors for local taxation, business tax arrears under current 2019-2020. Assuming they're supposed to have brackets around them and in red rather than negative black, and the one below as well for the business rates. Just in terms of amendments. Who would like to ask some questions? Charles.
Yes, it's to do with the, and we did discuss this last year, I know, the pension fund, and in particular the assumptions which you said are applied by the actuary are set out below, and this is on page 119. Because we've had this situation where we have a pension fund surplus, yet of course these accounts show a deficit. But I wanted to ask particularly why, when you have, I think, well, the actuary has understandably raised the assumption about price increases, that there'll be greater inflation in the long term, that goes up, but the discount rate goes down. So what's the story behind this?
Thank you. Yes, we're just getting to the right page. So I have only got, is it page 119?
Yeah.
So, sorry, Councillor, could you just repeat the question on?
Well, yes, it's at the top of the page that lists the assumptions, and obviously the fact that you've increased the inflation assumption but reduced the discount rate is not good news. So I wondered why they were going in opposite directions.
So, in terms of the inflation assumptions and discount rate, they're not quite the same thing. So obviously in terms of following each other exactly. So in terms of the returns, where we're looking at the end of last year, there'd been a significant rally in terms of assets. So you had assets at all-time highs or very close to all-time highs across the board in terms of bonds, equities, most things. So your future return assumptions are reduced because you're not expecting to be able to replicate those returns forever. So they've essentially built in more of a prudence in future returns. That's the main reason the discount rate's reduced. But in terms of, that's more funding related, but also in terms of it follows yields as well. So where discount rates, yields are at all-time lows as well in terms of government bonds, etc. So your assumptions will go down accordingly, even though we have had some inflation increases creeping in terms of future expectations. But currently, bond yields are still really low.
Thank you.
Yep, David.
Michael Tarrin, page 3, 4.1, members of the public have a right to inspect the council's accounts and ask questions. There were 4 questions, 4 queries from the press and public. Can you expand on what they were about? I mean, if they were trivial, you can say they're trivial, but it would just be helpful to know what the substance was if they were important.
Yeah, so there were 4 individual questions. Well, there were questions raised by 4 individuals. Within that, there were lots of sub-questions from particular individuals. 3 of the 4 individuals, it was specifically related questions around Grenfell. And for the 4th individual, it was a range of different questions, actually ranging across all different services. Some of those were answered as part of the accounts. Some of those questions just didn't fall within the remit of the scope of the accounts. Some of them didn't fall within the remit of FOIs, and they were just general questions that he was asking Council's opinion on. So all of those were responded within the deadline, but 3 of the 4 were by nature related to Grenfell and the Grenfell figures within the accounts.
Is that okay, David? Yep. Liz?
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I just noticed that in the balance sheet that debtors had doubled and creditors had doubled from the prior year, and it just stood out to me. And then also the credit losses against debtors was a percentage of 21.4%. That seems quite high. So I just query that. In terms of sort of minor corrections, on page 10, we say will be published in June 2021. I'm not sure what date we're going to date the accounts, but I think it's probably the 28th of September, so that needs to be corrected. Page 11, we say adjusted outturn 21-22, I think it should be 2021. And then on page 14, we say we've got risk is described over the following pages. There's no description of risks on the following pages. And then on page, I think it's 15, we make references to various other statements, and those page references are all going to change now. And that's it. Thank you. But the debtors and creditors jumping up so much.
In terms of the creditor, so on page 69, which is obviously the more detailed breakdown in terms of the balance sheet, we can see probably the largest movement is around central government bodies. Sorry, on page 69, a table at the top. So, and I think you'll recall from the last audit committee, we talked quite a bit about the business rates and the amount that we had at the point of the 31st of March, but that would immediately be paid back to central government as part of the business rates reforms that were in place. So that's the essentially the explanation for creditors. And I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to come back with you on the debtors. That's the one bit, I kind of preempted all of the questions, and I preempted the creditors question, but not the debtors question. So if you don't mind, I'll just follow that up to kind of provide a detailed explanation. Yeah, yeah.
If I may add a point, going back to our earlier point with the discussion with Grant Thornton. So page 58, as Councillor Lindsay has already asked about what were the 4 questions that the public asked, I would be gobsmacked if next year's questions they're not asking about page 58, which is, again, the exit packages. I think on top of this, and I don't know whether, because it comes in a couple of areas, but on the action tracker, you were due to send out, it states that you sent an email on the 22nd of September regarding an item in here, but I don't think anyone's received it. Because that may offer some explanation on this, in which case, if it does, we really need to put it into the accounts.
So the email I sent on the 22nd of September was in relation to the one individual that we were talking about at the last committee, which we updated the accounts to reflect, and also I circulated an email to provide an explanation, but it looks as though that didn't receive...
I didn't get that. No, sorry, 20, it was right, 22nd of September it says in the action tracker.
Okay.
Cosette had it?
Thank you for raising this point, Chair. I wonder if perhaps there could be some narrative added to the bottom of page 57, which is the lead-in to the table at the top of page 58 that's mentioned, completely appreciating that there is confidentiality sensitivity here regarding individuals that are represented in the table. It does stand to reason that at the bottom of page 57, some additional color could be given without jeopardizing any such confidentiality.
Yeah. But Cosette, while we've got you there, you didn't receive an email on the 22nd of September?
I'd have to double check, but I don't recollect that.
But if you can look into that and certainly resend that, David?
On this matter, can we have confirmation that all the payments made this year were to people who were what I would call bona fide employees of this year, and that nothing relates to the package of people who had left in prior years, but about whom there may have been protracted negotiations lasting more than a year, so that the total of 1224071 does actually relate to the relevant year, to people who were employed at the beginning of the year rather than for people who started, or who rather finished in 1920 or even before. And I'm not necessarily asking for an answer now, but if that could be clarified later.
So I think there's some points for the action tracker, but also, you know, I think as a committee, we strongly think we need to look at the wording on this and add wording in to give some sort of explanation as to these large numbers that are being paid out.
That's in terms of explaining more what the redundancy costs and pension contributions are, why they arise, that sort of thing is what we're talking about.
I mean, why is one person being paid £351,912 as an exit package? Right. To anyone, if I was a self-respecting journalist and I was going through these accounts, or member of the public, that would flash out bright red lights. Why is somebody being paid that much from council funds? I mean, I'm angry about it.
Just to build
we
on...
need to explain this, and quite honestly, quite a few of those need to be explained. They're very, very large.
Just to build on that, without knowing the details of that particular thing, let's say, for example, that some of what needed to be paid there was because there was a legal requirement to do certain things. It still requires explanation nonetheless. It's quite a substantial amount of money.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it will be because of their age and their pension entitlements without identifying the individual. So we can put more about that if somebody who is age 55 is made redundant, if they're aged 55 and they get early payment of their pension, there is a pension strain cost, and that will drive a big figure in the accounts.
Yep.
So perhaps we can put more detail on that.
We need that in.
Mr. Curtis, perhaps one suggestion could simply be to have the wording that says it was paid in line with legal requirements or requirements under the law without necessarily getting that specific if it would jeopardize confidentiality for the individual. I think the point is that there are legal requirements to this amount of money. That's what's driving that amount. And that's not clear at all from what's here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Everybody happy with that? Yeah. Any further points or questions from anyone? Our next meeting is on the 22nd of November. My view is that we should wait till then as a committee to approve. If everyone is happy with that, giving you plenty of time to get it done. I mean, I know we could be quicker, you could email them round and everything like that, but is there really any point? We're well ahead of the game, and I'd rather give you time to make any amendments. Okay, well, as a compromise, then can you send us a finalised copy to all members?
Are things that we can address fairly quickly. So it would be preferable if we could be one of the first to publish. We were one of the first to put it online.
I know. It's a badge of pride that I understand, and I don't want to take anything away from the financial management team.
And having done the audit quickly as well.
Right, okay, how about this? If you can make the amendments requested and the further details requested and email it round to all committee members, and then I will get the responses from the committee members as to whether they recommend that I can sign, and then I will come in and sign.
And could we see the audit opinion as well?
Yes. That goes for Grant Thornton's additions as well. Okay. Great. Any idea of when that might be? Where are we now? End of September? Don't overpromise numbers.
I'm not going to overpromise, but it would be really nice to make the end of September. So let's see. Let me take that away and let me see how quickly we can turn around. Because I think, as Mike says, some of them we can turn around really quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, but let me take that back to...
And Paul can? Great. We'll all keep refreshing our send and receive buttons. Okay. Thank you. If there are no more questions, then we can move on to the minutes held on the 22nd of July. Now, Paul and Ellen, I know I said you could go, you can't go. I've just got one request, really, that is in these minutes somewhere, and is certainly on the action tracker, and certainly what we discussed at the last meeting, where the officers put a lot of work and effort into compiling a financial report on post-Grenfell expenditure, which we reviewed at the last meeting. I know you've had sort of informal conversations with officers as to whether you would, as a firm, be happy to review that and effectively sign off that those numbers are true and fair. We're not asking you to make any comments as to whether the money was well spent or not, or the impact or anything like that. We're just asking, we would be asking as to you believe those numbers to be true and fair, bearing in mind that you've audited most of them anyway. And I believe that if we put a sort of specific request through to you, which is coming now, this is it, would you be able to take that back to your office? Because I know there'll be things you'll need to discuss with fellow partners. And perhaps officers could put together a scope as to what we think that would look like. And yeah, circulate round the committee. And I think probably circulate it round the committee with Paul and Ellen on the email. And then we can narrow that down and then have your opinion. Great.
We can certainly, if you're able to put a scope in writing, we can have the two considerations we'd need to consider as a firm is one, is it prohibited under the regulatory conflicts, ethical conflicts, because it may conflict with, or even the perception of a conflict with the audit. And then secondly, whether the assurance you're looking for is assurance that we as a firm could sign up to in terms of being able to provide. So if you're able to give us, if you set out your scope, we can look at that through our ethics procedures.
So can we put that on action and an urgent action as well? And Paul has just given us a definite maybe.
No, I just wanted to say, so obviously we've had some just informal kind of emails back and forth about potential, but I think it still needs a further conversation with external audit colleagues about what the potential is for the reasons I think Paul's just highlighted. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. You may now leave. Should you so wish, you're more than happy to stay. Right, we're going to do the minutes now. If I can find them. Any comments on the minutes? Quite a lot of discussion in the last meeting. A lot of action points that, from what I can see, have gone through onto the action tracker. We are missing some. Eagle-eyed Liz.
Yeah, there were just a couple. It was in A4, strategic risk register to be brought to the September meeting, and that's not on the actions. And
So,
It is?
yeah, apologies, Chair. We will be bringing that to the November meeting. We'd agreed because of the short time we had for the meeting this evening that we'd defer that to the November meeting, but that will be coming to November meeting.
Okay.
Okay, and then on page 3, there was a further report on this will be brought to the September meeting.
Can I just check which page, which item that was? Sorry, please.
Sorry, where it is in the, it's about halfway down.
Is this on the action tracker or
No, it's in the minutes,
in the minutes
page
on
3,
Page 3.
halfway down. A further report on this will be brought to the September meeting. Didn't see that in the action tracker.
So I think, Chair, that's just the item we were just talking about with the external auditors about providing the scope for you as a committee to be happy with.
Right.
For them to come back to us. Yep.
Okay. Okay. I mean, you know, there is urgency on this. So, well, as we've discussed with Grant Thornton, let's get that scope out to see what we can do on that. Sorry, Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I wasn't at the last meeting, but it seemed quite clear in the actions that you were going to follow up on Grant Thornton to carry out the review of the Grenfell expenditure. And I wonder if you and Mike could actually say, well, tell us if you've got any reservations about doing that, because it seems strange. It was such clear action. It hasn't been followed up, and you were coming back to this meeting with it.
So, and I know colleagues have gone, so I did follow up with Ellen and Grant Thornton colleagues about what the potential is, and I think for the reasons that Paul's just highlighted, they're quite restricted in terms of their kind of the scope of the audit that they can do. So they were having conversations, obviously back at Grant Thornton, about whether they would be able to do that piece of work, and I think there's a further conversation now to have with Paul. Actually, colleagues have been caught up with the external audit of the accounts. So I think when we said September, that was quite optimistic, because we know they're quite literally still working on their audit now. So I think the potential for them to do an additional piece of work on the Grenfell report was going to be quite limited over this period of time. But let me take that forward as a conversation with them. I think that I didn't take that as a definite yes that they would be able to, so I do think there's a further conversation to have with Grant Thornton.
No, it was a definite maybe from Paul.
A definite maybe.
Yeah. Which brings me to my next point is, what are we going to do if it's a no?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Sorry.
I think then, Chair, we're back where we were before that, to come back to an options paper about what is feasible and practical, because there are a number of issues with seeking to engage the other firms who carry out external audit work, because they were recipients of payments from the authority in the aftermath of Grenfell. So we need to come back to you, I think, if it's a no, with a number of options for you to consider as a committee as to how we best approach it.
I think we need to get slightly ahead of that, and look, the scope needs to be done for either Grant Thornton or another. But if you could also compile a list of who else we could go to, and if there are potential conflicts with that list of the big four, other consultancy firms, highlight those for us, because, we don't want this to be a linear process. Let's try and get ahead of it. Okay. Any further questions on the minutes? David? No. Thanks, Robert. Right, I think we're on to A5. David Amora.
So I'll ask Moira Mackey, my Head of Internal Audit, to introduce the report, Chair, for you, and we'll take questions.
Thank you, David. We did a summary report to you quite recently, so this isn't particularly long. We have completed some work and positive assurance, which is good, and the report shows in Appendix 1 where we are so far to date, and also all the work that's in progress, which is quite varied and in a number of different areas, and hopefully gives you some comfort that we are progressing well through a number of different aspects of the plan. We did include in Appendix 2 a summary of the areas that we have just completed. Inevitably, the one on the prepaid cards is a little bit longer because it's quite a process that had to be explained.
Can I just ask a quick question
on
that? What sort of amounts are we talking here? There's no reference to, is it a prepaid card for £5 for airtime, or is it, or, what amounts are we talking about here?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you the amounts, but it would be for things like care packages or support or therapy. So it would have been assessed through the support workers. I would have to actually go back to see what the actual limits were.
I think it would be useful just to understand the quantum.
Okay. So that's rather detailed, and there's a fairly lengthy explanation of the emergency planning piece that we did, which came out as satisfactory assurance. But also attached in Appendix 3 is quite a lengthy description of all the different pieces of work that we've undertaken since 2017-18 in respect of Grenfell processes that have been put in place since the tragedy. This was requested at the meeting of the committee back in May, so we've included in there a number of all of the work that we've done, which covers not just the assurance pieces that we've done, but what we call advisory reviews, which is where we are usually involved at some point as a process evolves to try and provide some comfort that they're putting in the appropriate controls or where they could improve controls going forward. Now, obviously, some of these are quite old now. If you think back to 2017-18, some of them were in response, immediate response, and those processes have moved on. All of the areas that we audit, regardless if they're assurance or advisory, if we make recommendations, we do follow them up, and we do report those back to you. And we're confident that all of the areas, apart from the most recent ones, which obviously are taking a little bit longer to implement the recommendations, we're quite comfortable that the older pieces of work were acted upon as required from our audits. So, I mean, I don't know if you recall, but the Grenfell Housing Repair Service, that was reported back in July. And we've got the service coming to the meeting in November to give you an update on that, and we're looking at the follow-up at this moment. So that's one of the more recent ones.
And that was requested by Councillor Dencode, I think, as well, more information on that.
Yeah, and it's an area where there's a lot of new processes and new ways of doing things that just never existed before. And it's taking a little bit of time to get them exactly right, but we're in touch with the service now, monitoring the implementation, and that they're happy to report on that at the next meeting. So that was all I was going to say, really, just to introduce what was there.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a lot of work. So thank you to you and your team. Cosette.
It is a lot of work. You've clearly been very busy. I did have a few questions, if I may. Thank you, Chair. On page 2 in the table about audit outcomes, it lists St. Joseph's RC Primary School with a high priority recommendation of 1, and yet the report, the appendix, says that it's 0. Which is it, please? So if I may just be specific, on page 2 the table says 1, on page 3 it says 0, and then in the narrative on page 6 it says that there are no significant issues identified. So I was just curious, is that a typo somewhere? Which one is it?
I have just pulled up the report. The appendix is correct. I apologise. The table in 5.1 is incorrect.
Okay, thank you.
It's 042.
That is comforting, actually, to know. That was my first question. My second question, following on from the points raised by the chair, is on page 7 with regard to the prepaid cards audit. It says in the first bullet, there's no policy or process in place for recouping funds. So my first question is, when the recipients were in receipt of these cards, were there any terms and conditions? And the terms and conditions didn't specify that funds were liable to be recouped if they were misspent?
They signed an agreement for the card. There is a policy that outlines that if it is used for incorrect purposes, they will be warned. I think there's a process of 2 warnings, and then they can restrict the card. But there isn't anything specific saying, and we will recoup the money that you have spent inappropriately. There's nothing actually in there, and they want to have a conversation to ensure that it's appropriate as well, because I think there are degrees of spending something on what you shouldn't be spending it on, and whether or not there needs to be a little bit of management. Perhaps going forward you get a reduced amount maybe the next time, just to offset any mistakes. But there isn't anything in there to say what to do to get the money back, or did the council just accept that it was a mistake and move on? I think
obviously it's a sensitive matter, as you say.
It is very sensitive, and that's why there needs to be a little bit more work done in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. And then my last question was with regard to the summary of work of all of the different audit activities with regard to Grenfell in general. And my question is just a summary one, which is, as you had noted in your introduction of the paper, some of the audits took place quite some time ago. My question is this: of all of these audits, how many of them have outstanding audit points that have yet to be closed? Are there any aged actions that have yet to be fully addressed?
I would say none of... There may be a couple in the last year or so, which might have 1 or 2 We're actually just chasing up some on the curve at this moment, we hadn't quite finalised them. We do keep going back until we get sign-off, so we don't let it go. Things do change, of course, and if they change, they become non-relevant. We would report that as well. But in the very early ones, they were all addressed, and we are also now involved in looking forward into the different, what the new provision will be, and the consultation process and the governance. So it's following on through going forward as well. So I'd be very confident that the old work is signed off fine. Maybe a couple of areas from about 2018-19 which would not be high priority. They would be medium to low, and could be some areas where things have actually moved on and are not relevant anymore.
Perhaps there's... Sorry, does someone want to add something? If I could just clarify your remark. Clearly, so what I believe you're saying is that the high priority items have been addressed and closed, but there may be medium and low priority items that have not been addressed and closed?
There would be none that would be not addressed at all. They would be partially. There could be some that were partially addressed, and then something might have changed since then. I would actually have to go back and look at each one and see how relevant it was still as well, because some of these processes don't exist anymore. So.
Sure, things change over time, of course. Yeah. So perhaps one action to consider, if others agree, would be to do a review of all the audit points that are outstanding, you know, looking at them from aged going forward and reassessing their veracity, because as you rightly say, other things may have superseded them anyway, or there may be different actions to be taken. But what shouldn't happen is lingering.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Those were all my questions.
Yeah. I mean, I was similarly concerned when I read this, that it appeared to be outstanding actions, and you know, the curve, there were 12 findings, and at the time of writing only 5 have been actioned. I think we need to have a follow-up and make sure that they are.
Which we are doing, and yes, I apologise for that.
Any other comments or questions to Moira or David? Thank you very much. Great report. Now I'm confused. What's going on here? Right. Yes. Oh, I see. Did I do the minutes? No, but I did the minutes in the wrong place. But that's all right. Minutes are done. So we're on to A7, which is the action tracker. And obviously, a couple of points that have been raised already are Taryn's email. If you can get those, that's the map as well as the, as well as the other point. Any other comments on there? And I understand you have had a meeting, the joy of a meeting with Councillor Lindsay to go through spreadsheets. You've done that? Brilliant. Any other comments on the action tracker?
I think, Chair, if I may just note for the committee that you had a meeting with the Chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee and officers, and we've agreed that there'll be a sort of a session before the next Audit Committee. It's a joint informal meeting between Overview and Scrutiny and Audit Committee to discuss the Grenfell expenditure-related reports we've covered here already, and the impact assessment report which is being done for the Overview and Scrutiny Committee.
Has that email gone out?
So I will double check.
I've seen the draft of the email.
It's due to go out, so I'll double check if that's gone out or not. Yeah.
Okay. So we had a joint meeting to decide action, and we rather cleverly shoehorned it into our meeting on the 27th of November, which is due to start at 6 o'clock. Okay. What, to get our meeting done in an hour? Mind you, actually, I mean, that might be possible. or we might start early. Okay, we'll discuss it, but we're going to try and have our meeting and then a joint meeting with the OSC on the 22nd of November, in which case we're scheduled to start at 6, but if I can put you on warning that we may start a bit earlier in order to get through everything, from our point of view, before we move on to the joint meeting. Happy? Thanks for bringing that up, David. And you will get an email to that effect shortly. Great. No further items? Great. Thank you very much. See you on the 22nd of November. Thank you to everybody here.
Thank you, Chair.